The word saga is ancient and it means story or legend. Some of the most famous stories in history are sagas. Most of them talk of heroes and describe long voyages and large-scale conflicts. Most of them are also fictional, but the one that I'm about to tell you in the next 9 episodes is completely true. The story of the Soviet space program does have its heroes, both sung and unsung. It does have its long voyages to undiscovered places, and it does revolve around a great conflict, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is a complex story where great fame contrasts anonymity, where communism contrasts capitalism, where East competes against West. My name is Alex Deva, and this is one of the greatest stories in modern history, the Soviet Space Saga. In this introductory episode, I'm going to set the scene and explain a few things. When I did the research for this podcast, I learned a ton of things that I hadn't even known about at the beginning. There are so many stories that are waiting to be told, some tragic, some funny, all of them amazing. I'm listing my sources in the description text of each episode, so you can have a look and find out more for yourself. One of my favorite sources was a book called Beyond, written by Stephen Walker. If you only read one book about this subject, make it this one. It doesn't matter if you prefer fiction to fact. This book is the latter presented as the former. I am also an author, and some of my books are about space. I'm hoping that listening to this podcast will engage your curiosity about my novels, because I do like to tell stories. When it comes to the stories about the Soviet space program, the things that feel most prominent to me are the historical firsts. There was an incredible number of firsts that this endeavor has generated, such as the first object in Earth orbit or the first human being in space. The episodes of this podcast will therefore be centered around these accomplishments. There have been many books that talk about what the Soviets did in space. Some are biographies of the key people, others are historical accounts, and yet others focus on comparisons with the American counterpart program. In this podcast, I'm telling the stories focusing on the firsts. The sheer scale of these exploits is even more momentous once you realize that they had to happen for the first time at some point. Context, as always, is everything. I'd like to make a few clarifications about my use of the word Soviets. Most authors prefer to say Russians instead. I choose to call the Soviets Soviets. First of all, because the distinction is relevant to my particular podcast, where I only focus on the historical period of Soviet rule. Secondly, because many of my protagonists aren't ethnic Russians. And third, because having grown up in a socialist country, I simply got used to the word. Most of the stories that I'm about to tell take place in the desert of Kazakhstan. Today there is a cosmodrome there, and it is called Baikonur Cosmodrome. The name Baikonur comes from a mining town that's over 300 kilometers away from the actual cosmodrome, so you might be forgiven for being a little confused. In fact, that was exactly what the Soviets planned when they used this name, to confuse Western spies as to the real location of their space center, which is in a place called Tyuratam. Before 1955, Tyuratam was nothing more than a train station on the long railway between Europe and Central Asia. But when the Soviet government, at the advice of scientists, decided to establish their missile complex there, it suddenly popped up on the map. Or rather, it would have popped up if it hadn't been such a great secret. 10,000 workers were sent to build it, and despite being one of the most remote places in the world, it became the world's largest missile complex, over 100 times the size of Cape Canaveral in the United States. The launch pad itself was so huge even the cosmonauts were in awe looking at it. The flame pit alone, a big hole in the ground designed to contain the fire and the smoke from the biggest rocket that mankind had built at the time of its launch, this flame pit was comparable to the Grand Canyon. But while the Grand Canyon is natural, this was entirely made by man. For thousands of years, the only people living in that wilderness had been Kazakh nomads. Summers in Tyuratam often see temperatures of 45 degrees and minus as much during winter. It is a place of extremes in terms of climate, science and human audacity. In Tyuratam they had no warm beaches like in Florida, no cosmopolitan communities and no extravagant nightlife. This was a place so inhospitable that only a country like the Soviet Union could have planned to make it the center of its space program. Join me in the next episode to find out how the Soviet space program started. This has been the introductory episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.